welcome to Trendlines, a podcast on global affairs brought to you by World Politics Review. I'm Elliot Waldman. Just a quick note before we get started that if you like what you hear on Trendlines, you can stay up to date with new episodes by hitting the subscribe button wherever you get your podcasts, if you haven't done so already. You can also find a full archive of previous episodes at worldpoliticsreview.com/podcast. Until this year, the conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan over the disputed region of Nagorno-Karabakh was known as a frozen conflict. The majority ethnic Armenian enclave is within the internationally recognized boundaries of Azerbaijan, but had been effectively administered by Armenia for over 2 decades. Then, in September, the frozen conflict rapidly melted into 6 weeks of full-scale war, leaving thousands dead and tens of thousands more displaced. Several attempts at internationally mediated ceasefires broke down as the battlefield was dominated by Azerbaijani forces, with significant support from Turkey. Finally, as Azerbaijan looked poised to advance deep into Nagorno-Karabakh, Russia brokered a peace agreement with the two sides under terms that require Armenia to make painful concessions. The agreement also stipulates that Russia will oversee implementation of the agreement, with 2,000 peacekeepers on the ground. But as my guest for today has pointed out, the situation remains fragile, and while Russia has successfully reasserted itself as the indispensable power in the South Caucasus, the agreement is a potent indication of a rapidly changing power balance in the region. Joining me now from Moscow to discuss this is Alexander Gabuyev. He's a senior fellow and the chair of the Russia and the Asia-Pacific program at the Carnegie Moscow Center. Alex, welcome to Trendlines.
Thanks for having me.
Take us back, if you will, to the eruption of fighting between Azerbaijani and Armenian forces in late September. Did Moscow see this coming?
I think that in Moscow, it was an open secret that once the situation deteriorates and there is an external or internal trigger, the resumption of hostilities is very likely. I think that the Kremlin took note of the 2016 military conflict when Azerbaijani side was victorious and showed its superiority, although it didn't get any significant territorial gains. But back then, the military picture of the conflict was pretty obvious for the Kremlin. And I think that the Russian side has advised the Armenian side all the time that the military balance of power between Armenia and Azerbaijan is changing in favor of Baku, and Armenian side should use the current situation as a leverage in order to get the best negotiated deal over the table of negotiations, not in the battlefield. So I guess Moscow was preoccupied back in September with multiple other crises popping up. The COVID numbers have gone up significantly in Russia again. So the government was dealing with the pandemic situation at home. The Russian government was dealing with the aftermath of crisis in Belarus, where President Alexander Lukashenko has suppressed liberal democratic protest movement, and Moscow had to address this crisis as well. And then Moscow was obviously very carefully watching the presidential race in the United States. And although we see that the Russian intelligence services had some prior information on the preparations on the Azeri side, either Moscow didn't have the capacity to prevent the war very early on, or it didn't think that it's necessary to kind of try to prevent something which was unpreventable. From the leaks that the Russian intelligence service, the SVR, has done to the Russian press, for example, a very interesting report by Yelena Chernenko, the most insightful Russian foreign policy journalist in Kommersant newspaper. I think that the Russian authorities had a pretty accurate picture of the preparation, including the role of Turkey. But still, I think that the offset of hostilities came as surprise, and the Kremlin was still preoccupied with many other things.
Tell us a little bit, just to set the scene here, about Russia's relations with Armenia and Azerbaijan. They're both former Soviet republics, but have kind of different relationships with Moscow on their own terms, no?
Absolutely. I think that all three republics in South Caucasus, Georgia, Azerbaijan, Armenia, have their own history of relationship with Moscow and have different experiences, both during the imperial and Soviet past, and very different experiences following independence. with Armenia and Azerbaijan, I think that Azerbaijan pretty early on having the oil wealth that became so visible at the turn of the 21st century when the oil price started to boom after U.S. invasion in Iraq, was gradually taking steps to become more independent and walk out of Moscow's shadow in a very well calibrated and respectful manner. So Azerbaijan was not part of the many Russian integration blocks that Moscow created, except for the Commonwealth of Independent States. That's where all of the Soviet Union republics, except for the Baltic states, belonged, and that became a very anemic club of powers. But there are two major organizations, the Organization for Collective Defense Treaty and the Eurasian Economic Union. So one is a Russian-centered military bloc, which is resembling NATO to some extent, with some weaker security assurances, but which definitely positions Moscow at the center of the security arrangements in the post-Soviet space. And the other is the Eurasian Economic Union, which is modeled after the European Union. So it's an idea to create joint markets for labor, goods, services, and also a regulation that's supranational. So there is a Eurasian Economic Commission that governs some part of economic activity of the member states, like the European Commission does in the EU. And although both mechanisms are not very mature and are very imbalanced because of outsized role of Russia, we don't have a kind of balanced relationship like Germany and France and other member states in the EU have. It's very Moscow and Russia centered. So Armenia is part of both. Azerbaijan is part of neither of these organizations. And still, Moscow tries to balance both relationships because Armenia is seen as a country that doesn't have too many other options because of Karabakh conflict and because of this growing imbalance with Azerbaijan, because of troubled relationship with Turkey, marked by history of genocide and very kind of strained relationship with the current leadership. And it's a landlocked country that has to rely on a bigger power to provide security. And that power, for multiple reasons, is Russia. Whereas Azerbaijan has other options. It has a big neighbor with the same Turkish roots and a very close cultural, ethnic affinity. That's Turkey. It also has a very carefully balanced relationship with the West. It's an authoritarian regime, but a regime that produces oil and gas, that wants to supply them to European markets bypassing Russia, and where the US has interest to check Russian power. So I think that Russia's game was always to keep Armenia close, but at the same time have a balanced, constructive relationship with Azerbaijan and not alienate it too much. And I think that Azerbaijan managed to play that game very skillfully.
So if Armenia is one of Russia's treaty allies, like you said, it belongs to the Collective Security Treaty Organization, why did Moscow not come to Armenia's defense more forcefully in this recent war?
The problem here is that Karabakh is inside the internationally recognized border of Azerbaijan. And Moscow was very explicit all the times that if territory of Armenia proper will come under attack, Russia will without any doubt come to Armenia's defense. When it comes to Karabakh, Armenia is on its own because it occupies, in a way, parts of internationally recognized territory of Azerbaijan. The conflict itself is very complicated, and Russia has humanitarian obligations there in a way, though they are not formalized, and some moral obligations. At the same time, it sees that the situation is very complex. Besides Nagorno-Karabakh proper, which is predominantly populated by Armenians, there are 7 regions of Azerbaijan that have been annexed and are or used to be controlled by the Armenian forces as a security belt. around Nagorno-Karabakh. And the whole negotiation process brokered by the Minsk group with permanent co-chairs like Russia, the United States, and France had various forms of returning those regions to Azerbaijan and then discussing the status of Nagorno-Karabakh. So I think that Russia was pretty clear-cut that if Armenia faces another war in Karabakh, Russia will not come to its rescue.
You mentioned also the difficult relations that Russia has with Armenia's current leadership under Prime Minister Nikol Pashinyan. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Nikol Pashinyan came to power following a popular revolution, popular democratic street revolution in 2018. And although Moscow didn't prevent his rise, it didn't interfere much into the revolution, but he deposed a government that was seen as friendly towards Russia and where President Putin has very extensive network of contacts and personal relationship, particularly with former President Robert Kachiryan. And here, I think that Moscow was allergic to a change of power that happened in the street and that brought an liberal activist. But at the same time, I think that back then in 2018, Moscow was pretty calm because it realized that Armenia will not abandon Russia-led structures. It will not try to enter NATO or to become kind of more aspiring for European integration because it doesn't have too many options. I think that Russia was pretty calm, but at the same time, there was no chemistry, there was no functional relationship between President Putin and Prime Minister Pashinyan. At the same time, I think that most of the Russian officials I talked to view Pashinyan as one of the sources of the recent crisis. They believe that the previous government and many senior officials, including former President Serge Sargsyan, have fought in the war, knew that the military balance is tilting towards Azeri side. They were very careful in managing relationship with Baku, and although the relationship was pretty hostile, it was not an amicable and easy relationship. They realized how important it is to stay at the negotiation table, how to not make too many provocative statements, and how to maintain channels of communication with President Aliyev and his team. Nikol Pashinyan, because he had no combat experience, he has no relationship to Artsakh, banked a lot of his popularity on the Karabakh issue. And he made some very controversial statements when visiting Artsakh, which is the name of Nagorno-Karabakh in Armenia. He said that Nagorno-Karabakh, Artsakh, is Armenia. And he didn't have any functional relationship with Aliyev team, which added to frustration in Baku and supported the rise and importance of the war party in Azerbaijani elite. So I think that Moscow was aware of that. They were trying to tell Prime Minister Pashinyan that the course he's taken is very risky one. And I think that the people in Moscow believe that he didn't listen to friendly advice of Moscow. So when the trouble came, Russia should not pay with its blood and resources and straight relationship with Azerbaijan to correct for years of Pashinyan's mistake and probably decades of very mistaken Yerevan's foreign policy in Karabakh issue.
So when the conflict erupted, there was sort of a sense from Russian officials of, "Hey, we told you so."
In a way, that's a very accurate depiction, and I don't think that Moscow was under illusion that it's so powerful that it can prevent Azerbaijan when it feels necessary to use the military option. I think that many in Russia blame COVID in a way. So, taking Prime Minister Pashinyan aside. I think that one of the theories here is that, we had collapse of the oil price this year. We had multiple challenges to the popularity of the government in various countries, including in Russia, but also in Azerbaijan and Turkey. And there is a famous saying in Russia that in order to divert public attention, you need a small victorious war. And that goes back to the 1905 Russian war against Japan, which Russia ultimately lost. So Russia's experience with Little Victorious War was a terrible one. But still, the saying is that sometimes countries need to start wars which they think they have a very good chance of winning because of domestic troubles. And that's part of the Russian reading of why President Aliyev decided to launch a military offensive and why Turkey decided to support it. Also, the window of opportunity was there, and it was a short window because the U.S. was distracted by the domestic drama called U.S. presidential election 2020. Russia, again, was distracted by domestic situation and Belarus, and then the European Union was absent from the picture. So that provided a very good but narrow window of opportunity to turn the tables and use the military option.
And from Russia's perspective, they were able to essentially let the conflict play out to the point where it got so bad for Armenia that they had to throw in the towel, and then they stepped in to negotiate this peace agreement last week. What does Russia stand to gain from this deal?
First, I don't know how much we can really talk about a deliberate strategy to wait out the conflict becomes so bad for Armenian side that defeat seemed inevitable and the Armenian side had to sign this agreement. But I think that Russia has shown, again, that it is an indispensable power. And when it comes to bring the two parties together, sign a deal that is not a peace agreement yet, but is a ceasefire and some framework to maintain peace and stop hostilities, at least for the short and probably medium term. It's only Russia that has trust of both sides and that has means to enforce this deal. So I think that for Russia, out of a situation where there have been not too many good options, if there have been any good options, Russia managed to insert itself in the conflict, put the peacekeepers that has been always the demand and desire of Russia going back to 1994, but didn't happen because of Azeri objections and very cautious attitude of France and the United States. So it managed to achieve one of its long-term goals, and also Moscow became an indispensable player in the way that the conflict will be resolved in the future.
Now, what is the role of Turkey in this agreement? Does Turkey have much of an ability to maintain its influence after the agreement was signed?
I think that Turkey's influence is far broader than its role in signing the agreement, which was basically not very visible. We don't know much about the diplomacy between Moscow and Ankara. There have been numerous phone calls between Erdogan and Putin, and a lot of diplomacy on the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Ministry of Defense channels. Turkey is not mentioned in the agreement, but then Russian and Turkish defense ministries have signed an agreement of conflict monitoring center, where there will be Turkish military monitors of the peace agreement implementation that will not be armed, but will help to monitor the implementation of the deal together with their Russian counterparts. We don't know whether that will be just remote control using drones, or there will be physical visits of Turkish officers to the conflict area. But again, Turkey is not in the agreement, but somewhere outside and very close. But Turkey's role is far bigger, both in this conflict and in South Caucasus. I think that Turkey has shown that it has military capabilities that's ready to provide for its partner and ally to achieve a military goal. The Russian reports say that Turkish officers have been operating the drones and have been helping a lot with military expertise for the Azeri forces. These reports are denied by Ankara and by Baku, but it's definitely clear that Turkey played a very visible role in both military aspects and definitely in the diplomatic and public encouraging aspects of this conflict. And then Turkey is a large economic player, definitely in Azerbaijan, but also in Georgia. Turkey is increasingly playing a bigger role as a source of soft power and using various soft power tools in this region. And it's clear that Turkey is part of the neighborhood. It's been here for centuries and it will be there for the indefinite time. Once the Soviet Union broke up, Russia lost its monopoly to control the South Caucasus. So all of the countries had interest to develop ties with their giant neighbors. And these giant neighbors include not only Russia or Iran, but Turkey first and foremost. So I think that this conflict was a very clear demonstration of Turkey's growing role in the region, which is very likely to stay.
And I would imagine that the fact that the United States and Europe, the Minsk group powers that don't include Russia, are absent from this process is pleasing to both Putin and Erdogan.
I think so. I think that we probably see an emergence of new regional security framework where the West is absent, and basically the mechanism and the presence of the Russian peacekeepers has not been sanctioned by the UN, but it's just an agreement between Russia and the host party with Turkey in the back. I think the problem going forward is that the peace deal is pretty fragile. There is a scenario where Armenia and Azerbaijan will be able to negotiate a solution and address the core issue, which is there still. That's the status of Nagorno-Karabakh. However, I think that unfortunately this scenario is very unlikely given the level of emotions in Armenia. This very bitter defeat is very hard to swallow. And I think that the leverage is completely changed. I think that the victorious address of President Aliyev, who mocked Prime Minister Pashinyan a couple of times in his speech, and he said that as long as he is president, there is no question of special status for Karabakh. So before the war, Armenia wanted independence. Azerbaijan was ready to grant a very vast autonomy. I think that now the best bet that Armenia can get is an autonomy. And again, this autonomy will be of far worse quality than the autonomy that Armenia could have gained if it would engage in more serious diplomatic effort. But after 5 years, when the deal expires, every party, both Armenia and Azerbaijan, will have the right to ask the Russian peacekeepers to withdraw. In here, we can well imagine a scenario where after 5 years, with no progress in the talks, Azerbaijan will say, oh, thank you, Russia, for providing your peacekeepers. Now they can return home, and we'll handle the situation. We will have all the tools to address issues of sovereignty over Azerbaijan and that. Thank you, goodbye. So what will Russia do? There is one scenario where Russia can say, oh, excuse me, Azerbaijan, we have moral and legal obligations to stay regardless of what the deal says, because we know very well what happens. We cannot allow ethnic cleansing of thousands of innocent Armenians, so we stay here regardless. Or Russia can try to broker a deal with Azerbaijan and Ankara in order to let the Russian peacekeepers stay and extend the agreement. Or it can rely on help from European Union and the West, including the United States, because they have also keen interest to prevent resumption of hostilities. So I think that the West has a role to play in the future, and it really very much depends on the level of Russia's relationship with the West, as well as proactive diplomacy on part of European Union and the United States.
You mentioned that Russia's desire to have peacekeepers on the ground is long-standing and something that they've been trying to do for a while. It's interesting to me because a lot of countries might see the imposition of their own troops as peacekeepers as kind of a burden or a cost. But for Russia, it's something that seems to signify sort of a return of influence in the region. What exactly are they seeing as the value of putting these peacekeepers on the ground?
I think that Russia sees, and this conflict has very well shown, that hard military instruments are still instruments of power. it doesn't matter how skillful your diplomats are. It does matter, but unless your diplomatic effort is supported by very credible military force, words might be empty. So here, I think imposing these tools of power in the conflict zone is a very clear demonstration of Russia's status. And Russia can use this tool to influence the situation. Once these peacekeepers are there, definitely the resumption of hostilities and a new attack of Azerbaijan on Karabakh is unimaginable. I think that Baku took lessons from 2008 war in Georgia, where President Mikhail Saakashvili tried to liberate South Ossetia and shelled the Russian peacekeepers, which gave Russia a very good pretext to invade Georgia. So this is one layer. The other layer is that Russia sees its peacekeepers as part of a more complex plan to establish some military footprint in the key regions where Moscow has interests. And South Caucasus is one. Russia didn't have military presence in Azerbaijan since withdrawal of its radar in Gabala. Now the Russian military is back. Russia is positioning its military in Syria. Russia has now signed a deal with Sudan to position a small naval base there. So it's a broader plan of return of limited military infrastructure that could help Russia to project power. I think that the peacekeeper contingency here will be limited, and power projection capability of this force will be limited. So it's a much more peacekeeping mission in a traditional sense, but it's informed by a broader logic of Moscow's return to the global stage as a powerful regional actor with some elements of the global reach that don't match the US capabilities exactly, but are far superior to what Russia used to have just 10 years ago.
Shifting a little bit back to the domestic impacts in Armenia, you mentioned the unpopularity of this peace agreement, the fact that Prime Minister Nikol Pashinyan's government is coming under tremendous strain. This week, we saw the foreign minister resign, and Pashinyan himself has so far resisted calls for his own resignation. But given the fragility of the government there, is there a chance that Pashinyan could fall and a new government could come into power that is less inclined to defend this unpopular agreement?
I think that the chances for Pashinyan to fall are there, and the situation remains very fluid, so I can't predict it. The problem is that every new government will have to account for the fact that the agreement is very unpopular. The problem is that Armenia doesn't have very good options to roll back the military balance. First, I don't think that throwing out Russian peacekeepers an option is there at all. But if it does, I think that the loss of Karabakh is very much in the cards and is very much inside. So the Armenian side had to sign the deal because the alternative was entire loss of Karabakh in a matter of a week or so. And I guess the problem has been very poor communication on the side of the Armenian government of how dire the situation is, and that the earlier on they made concessions, the better it is for the balance of control over Karabakh territory. Unfortunately, they made this decision too late, and unfortunately for Armenian side. So they lost not only the 7 regions of Azerbaijan that Armenian side has annexed, but also parts of the Karabakh territory.
For the Western powers, France, the United States, the OSCE, the EU, what do they need to do to regain more of a firm influence in resolving this issue?
I think reaching out to all of the parties, including Russia, and making the Karabakh process as one of the areas where constructive dialogue with Russia is maintained, because Russia is an indispensable power there, just as the West talks to Russia in Syria or in North Korea, where Russia's leverage and role is far smaller than here. I think that's a must. And then I think that the message is very much that Turkey, after all, is a member of NATO. US has tremendous leverage over Ankara. And in order to force Ankara and Baku to negotiate a settlement that would provide for interest of Armenians, Russian treaty allies, Russia should let the West in and not to prevent and try to shut it out.
Alex, thanks so much for joining us.
Pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Alexander Gabuyev is a senior fellow and the chair of the Russia and the Asia Pacific program at the Carnegie Moscow Center. If you'd like to comment on the discussion, ask a question, or even suggest a topic for a future episode, drop us a line at podcast@worldpoliticsreview.com. This episode of Trendlines was produced by me, Elliot Waldman, and edited by Peter Dury. You can follow the team on Twitter if you'd like. WPR's handle is @WPReview. I'm @Elliot Waldman with 2 L's, 1 T. And Peter is @PeterDoerrie. Thanks for listening, and tune in again next week.